Yes, the Global Green Growth Institute, or GGGI as we say, is an intergovernmental organization set up by treaty that now 38 member countries have joined. And what we do is we work together with our members to accelerate their transition to a model of green growth. And that's an economic growth model that is both more sustainable and more inclusive. And in practice that means working with them to fight the climate crisis, and right now, of course, this year, find ways to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, create green jobs, in a way that will at the same time also accelerate climate action.
Okay.
Well, certainly there is a deep sustainability crisis, not just climate and COVID, but we have been transgressing across many boundaries, planetary boundaries, some people even like to say, at the scale of our planet, destroying habitats, infringing on the habitats of wild animals. And most of those new diseases, because COVID-19 is not an exception, there are many zoonotic diseases that jump from animals to people. And yes, that happens because we clash with their natural habitats, because we destroy their habitat, because we eat wild animals, and so on. So yes, it is our difficult relation with nature, the multifaceted sustainability crisis that leads to plastic in the oceans, plastic in the fish we eat, air pollution that kills more people than the COVID-19 pandemic. And this year, all eyes are on this pandemic. But we think of it as part of this much deeper sustainability crisis. In the beginning of the year, I was quite worried that the COVID-19 pandemic would be a distraction and would move all attention away from thinking about climate and other sustainability issues. But I'm very pleased to see that actually for most people, for most normal people, the COVID-19 pandemic seems to be a realization that our normal way of life, that our normal way of doing business was indeed not sustainable. So I'm very pleased to see that for many people actually COVID-19 and climate and all the other environmental issues are kind of a wake-up call, a way that we really have to do business differently, that we have to find a way that will make planet Earth more sustainable for our children and grandchildren. And we call that green growth. So that is very much aligned with the mission of GGGI. I'm not sure that it was the pandemic that is undermining the multilateral system. Probably the last big success during our lifetime of the multilateral system was that the world came together to agree on sustainable development goals and the Paris Agreement 5 years ago. After that, we have had a number of elections, I would say, in the US, where Mr. Trump was elected, in Brazil, in Australia, where nationalism, populism were really powerful forces that led to election of leaders who didn't support the multilateral system. Now the pendulum seems to be swinging back, and I'm not just talking about the US election right now, but we had an election in Denmark of a young female prime minister with a strong consensus in society that there should be a stronger multilateral system, that there should be more profound climate action. The same in New Zealand, where Prime Minister Ardern was re-elected. And hopefully, even though not with such a strong mandate, a new President Biden would take the US back into the Paris Agreement. And maybe that can lead to rebuilding some of the energy that we had lost in the multilateral system. But in the session where I just was, people were calling for a new global governance, a new United Nations. And my own perspective is that I've worked with and for the United Nations for most of the last 40 years. During almost all that time, the UN has been in reform without quite managing the reform that we all think is needed. It took many years to achieve the agreement on climate that we call the Paris Agreement. So I don't really think that we need a new multilateral system. I think that we need to get more practical and make the Paris Agreement work. So that was my speech in the last session, to show that, you know, yes, it is great that we here in Korea see the Green New Deal pledge and the Net Zero pledge, but now translating that into practical action, you know. How rapidly can Korea transition away from coal? Can Korea commit to no longer fund coal-fired power plants in Vietnam as it recently did? The practical action underneath the big pledges is where I am more interested, you know, and where I'm more hopeful, because there are now commercially attractive alternatives. Renewable energy has become cheaper. Not everybody knows that. It is not smart to build a new coal-fired power plant. There are better investments. But of course will be losers then. There will be the entrenched interest, the incumbents who don't give up power, you know, easily at least. So we'll need to find a way to either compensate some of the losers or reskill some of the workers that lose their jobs in the brown economy. We call that just transition. So this is still going to be a fight. You know, it's not because the president proclaimed that Korea will join the Net Zero 2050 target group, which is a very important pledge. That by itself will not lead to action. Now we need to look under the hood. You know, we met this week with parliamentarians in your National Assembly here in Korea to talk about what it will take. And they were saying, well, it's nice to have a Green New Deal pledge, and it's nice to have the president say that he wants net zero by 2050, but do we have the laws? Is it in the budget? You know, what do we need to do to actually make it work? At the national level, at the provincial and local level, and frankly, we need to see much more engagement from the private sector. We need to see more companies. We've seen SK, 8 subsidiaries. We've seen Shinhan Bank. We've seen LG, only LG batteries, commit to some of these good goals. We need to see many more of the Korean private sector engage with these goals and figure out what it means for them, like we have seen many other companies in Denmark, but also in the US, even without government support. That is, I think, where we can make real progress. So we work mostly with developing and emerging countries, emerging economies, and you know, there's sort of two groups. The least developed countries, the really poor countries in Africa, and the small island developing nations, they have not really caused the climate crisis. You know, they have not really caused this instability in our economic system, but they are deeply affected. You know, Kiribati or other small islands in the Pacific, they're at risk from the increased typhoons, from sea level rise. Their primary income was tourism, which has stopped like that. Much more impact than here in Korea, say. So those countries deserve our solidarity and our support. We need to build their resilience. We need to support them in bringing back new green jobs. That is one group. And then there is another second group of mostly emerging economies like Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, where they are rapidly building their industry, where they are importing coal from Australia and from Indonesia. And there, I think, Korea has a large role because many of the factories in Vietnam are factories that are for Korean companies, because Korea provides finance for coal-fired power plants in those places. So international action is necessary to convince other countries that net zero 2050, like Korea committed to, is feasible, and to work through what that means in terms of finance, in terms of value chains, in terms of how the private sector behaves. As an international organization, we support that, but Korea, as the host of the P4G summit next year, now that there is a Korean Green Deal and a commitment to net zero 2050, I think Korea could play an important international leadership role. President Moon Jae-in has invited heads of government to, well, come to Seoul if they can travel, or otherwise participate virtually in that head of state meeting. And we hope that Korea will use its leadership position to convince other governments to join net zero by 2050. At the same time as Korea will need to think about its own more ambitious NDC commitments to the Paris Agreement. That's not 2050, that's 2030, which are due at COP26 next year. So yes, more ambitious, nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement are still a very important goal. We have to combine that now with the money that will go to recovery from COVID-19, because there's so much investment in the green recovery. It's not conceivable that there will be another big bag of money. So if you like, this is our last chance. We really need climate action in the next 10 years. So if so many governments are putting massive investments in COVID recovery and running up the bill, running up their indebtedness, then this is our last big chance to at the same time achieve climate action. So many countries that haven't quite realized that, because not all stimulus packages are green. There are still quite a few just brown stimulus packages. The stimulus packages after the previous financial crisis, 2008, 2009, had some green elements, but by and large they reinforced the brown economy. So leadership from Korea and from a few countries that have already come to this conclusion, to convince other countries to join that movement, to move away from coal, to accelerate renewable energy, do more on energy efficiency. There are many good actions that can be taken, both at home and internationally.